Five Nights at Freddy's uses low-fidelity graphics to represent important scenes in its narrative. Sometimes the details of these 8-bit minigames are meaningless. I don't think anyone really thinks that there are these many trash cans outside of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. Sometimes they exist to fit the video game aesthetic, such as every character using the same sprite. I don't think anyone believes that all these kids are wearing the exact same shirt. And sometimes they're meaningful, but because no one can agree on one interpretation, that meaning is the subject of endless debate. Welcome to the Horror Homestead, my name is GiBi, and in this video we're going to be discussing FNAF's most debated minigame, Midnight Motorist. Specifically, the mound you can find in the woods. Although we're gonna question whether it's really a mound at all. Midnight Motorist is a mini-game in the 6th FNAF game, FNAF 6. The player character of that minigame, Cheeto Man, drives a purple car. Some fans and theorists state that the car is purple to link it to the other times we've seen purple in the minigames, purple being the color of the murderer William Afton, as well as his car. Other fans and theorists say that because Cheeto Man is orange and not purple, that this is the game telling us he is explicitly not William, who is always depicted as purple. Without any other data, if this game existed as two sprites, an orange man and a purple car, both sides could discuss endlessly whether the car intends William, or if the man intends not William. And both have good points. Both camps can also try to explain away the other interpretation's incongruity. Cheeto Man is William believers will say that Cheeto Man is orange because at this point in the series there are two people, William and Michael Afton, who are both represented by purple sprites, and thus this is clarifying that it's not Michael. Cheeto Man is not William believers will say that the car is purple as a subversion of expectations. The player should begin the minigame thinking they're driving as William, only to leave the car and realize that they're not. No one would confuse an orange man for the character who was once named Purple Guy. Thus this is supposed to be an "oh wow, that's not what I was expecting" moment in gameplay. These camps can discuss endlessly back and forth with new pieces of reasoning and even try to debunk each other's debunks. If the minigame is so easily interpreted as Cheeto Man being William, why would game developer Scott Cawthon have worried about us confusing William with Mike if he were purple? Surely the context of the game that tells us Cheeto Man is William would also tell us that a purple man is William and not Mike. Or on the other side, if Scott intended us to know immediately that Cheeto Man is not William simply because of his color, why did he choose to make him the same color as William's animatronic mascot? If there's a color that's supposed to represent William besides purple, it's definitely a dark yellow or orange color. Why not make him green or blue? And on and on and on this debate can go. Midnight Motorist has many mysterious elements beyond the debate of who Cheeto Man is. Let's go over the minigame from start to finish and talk about some of them. Midnight Motorist tells the story of Cheeto Man returning home at night to discover that his son has broken out of his room. His window is smashed, there are human and animatronic footprints on the ground, and dialogue tells us that he has broken out to go to that place again. We know that Cheeto Man is quick to anger, likely abusive, and possibly drunk. There are two side areas you can visit while playing as Cheeto Man. One is a parking lot to a building called Junior's, where a green man tells Cheeto Man that he can't be there. The other is a clearing in the woods that leads to a differently colored patch of ground. Something is in the corner of this differently colored patch of ground. A very odd clump of pixels. No one can agree on the identity of Cheeto Man, what Junior's is, who the runaway is, when this game takes place, or what these pixels mean. And while I've thrown my hat in the ring already with my perspective on all of these things, I want to talk specifically about these pixels. Most people seem to think it's a mound of dirt. either a disturbed patch of dirt or an actual mound that's raised above the dirt around it. It's likely not a hole, as a hole would be colored darker than the ground around it. Light color typically indicates more surface area for light to bounce off of, and thus its lighter color either signifies that it's raised, or that it's not a mound at all. There are three main interpretations of the mound among the group who believe that Cheeto Man is William Afton. The first used to be more common, and was originally put forth by MatPat of Game Theory. That being that the mound of dirt in the woods calls back to the Twisted animatronics from the novel Twisted Ones. It should be noted that the Twisted Ones is not canon to the games. In that novel, these monsters bury themselves underground during the day. The problem with this theory is that Midnight Motorist takes place at night. If this was a Twisted One animatronic burying themselves underground, why would they still be underground? The second theory is that this is the secret entrance to the underground location the player character enters in FNAF 5 Sister Location. You ride an elevator deep below ground to find a structure where people work and animatronics are held. This pile of dirt could either be groundbreaking on the start of such a tunnel, or else discolored because it moves aside to allow access to a hatch that already exists. The third and more common interpretation is that it's a grave. Someone died, and instead of a proper burial, their body was hidden in the woods. In this camp, there are many different theories, including it being the body of Elizabeth, William's daughter, Dave, William's son, or even William's wife. The discolored patch appears to be slightly bigger than Cheeto Man, and so this theory appears to hold water. In the efforts of fairness, my own theory is that this is denoting a house being built. The differently colored patch around the mound is never addressed by theorists who think it's a grave, but I think it is intentionally and clearly in the shape of a house. The porch in front being a very clear indicator that it's actually the house shown on the menu screen for FNAF 4. Now, more recently, I have seen theories that try to account for this detail. For one, it's possible that this area is meant to be a callback to the red lake that Old Man Consequences fishes in FNAF World. It's in the woods, and this outcrop could be a dock of sorts. It could be that the lake dried up, and we're now seeing it in Midnight Motorist. The other and more tantalizing observation, not because I believe it to be true, but because it opens my thoughts to new possibilities, is that this is the outline of a building, but not one being constructed, instead, one that burned down. With this interpretation, a whole new world of possibilities are open to us. The Fazbear Frights location, the setting of FNAF 3, burns down at the end of the game. We're actually shown its ruins at the end of Sister Location, as a tease for FNAF 6, which is of course the game Midnight Motorist appears in. This is that building's imprint left behind. With this possibility, it would place Midnight Motorist after FNAF 3. With that interpretation, who is Cheeto Man? Is he Henry Emily? Is Midnight Motorist showing us what spurred him into action to begin his plan in FNAF 6? I think this is unlikely, as Henry's son, who did exist in the non-canon Silver Eyes trilogy, never plays a role in the games. Why would us seeing him run away matter if he never appears? If this patch is not FNAF 3's location being burned down, what if it's another fire? MatPat believes that the FNAF 1 building burned down as well. If you overlay the FNAF 1 map with the discolored area, the strange mound appears in the safe room. That's the room where the children were murdered. That's the room where William was killed. And that's the room that was boarded up for 30 years. With that said, the FNAF 1 location cannot possibly have burned down prior to FNAF 3, which brings us to the same problem of who Cheeto Man is. More recent games have depicted an event called Fall Fest. Fall Fest occurs in the woods, seemingly by one of the Afton's two houses, and is also very, very heavily hinted at to have burned down. I would say this is unlikely, given that Fall Fest was not introduced until much later entries in the series, but there is actually a nod to it in FNAF 6. The idea is that the FNAF 4 menu screen house, where the nighttime gameplay of FNAF 4 takes place, the Midnight Motorist house, and this house seen in the Fall Fest section of Help Wanted Curse of Dreadbear are the same house. This evidence is also used in other interpretations of the theory, but personally I don't see this at all. I see how the FNAF 4 menu screen and the Curse of Dreadbear house are the same, but the Midnight Motorist house just doesn't look similar to me. As I said earlier, this patch of ground in the woods seems much more likely to be the foundation of the FNAF 4 menu screen house. Unfortunately, this debate just brings us back to the fact that we're playing an 8-bit minigame. I don't think that the house in Midnight Motorist necessarily needs to look like the house on the FNAF 4 screen for them to be intended to be the same house. The 8-bit house is such an abstract representation that it doesn't matter that the details don't line up. The FNAF 4 house and the Curse of Dreadbear house lining up is almost certainly on purpose, and does mean that they're the same house. But looking different than the Midnight Motorist house does not mean that they aren't the same house. The same way that the color of dirt in the clearing does not mean it's a mound, but it does mean that it's not a hole. Just because mounds are lighter colored does not mean the lighter color indicates a mound. But because holes are darker colored, it being lighter colored indicates it's not a hole. If the 8-bit house was identical to the FNAF 4 house, it would show that it is the same house. It not being identical does not show that it's not the same house. Liberties have to be taken because of the game's graphical style. I don't think anybody literally thinks that there are 14 trees on screen, and that they're the same height as 3 Cheeto Men stacked on top of each other. I've never heard anyone address how Cheeto Man can walk over the discolored patch as if it weren't a mound on the ground. In Midnight Motorist, it's currently raining, but there are no muddy footprints around the area. We do see footprints later in the minigame, and some people theorize that the runaway character is coming to the mound. If the muddy ground and the rain cause footprints, why don't we see footprints other places? My answer is that the minigames in FNAF are what I call interpolistic. That's a term I coined to mean a combination of interpretive and symbolic. Interpretive, in this case, means that the minigame as a whole is intended to convey a mood, a tone, or a tale, the way that an interpretive dance is. A silent ballet like the Nutcracker can get a story across without dialogue by using music, facial expressions, and body movements. Likewise, a minigame can use atmosphere, music or lack of music, and sound effects to get something across, even when it's not using words. The clearing with the mound is in a separated place in the woods away from civilization. It's away from the busy highway, away from the busy building, away from the house. It's a secluded spot, and it makes us feel like it's mysterious in some way, like we shouldn't be here. It brings to mind places where bad things have happened, fires, hidden bodies. I don't think that if this same mound was placed just off the side of the road that many people would think it was a buried body, because while a mound can indicate that, it being hidden away like this calls to mind the idea of what hiding a body in the woods usually looks like. Because of the atmosphere of this scene, we are primed to think that it's something secretive and wrong. The clearing's secludedness also lends to the interpretation that it's where the runaway is going. It's a secret spot, out in the woods, a place that children might congregate, a place that someone might hide. If it's a grave, we can imagine someone praying or mourning or silently wanting to sit next to the grave of his sibling alone in the woods. This setting primes us to have these interpretations of the story. The problem is that sometimes details are just details. In FNAF 4, you can see the head of the Fredbear plush inside of a flower. This is clearly symbolic, and meant to be interpreted by the player as something that's not literal. The mound of dirt in the clearing in the woods in Midnight Motorist is more questionable whether or not it's meant to be interpreted by the player in a certain way, or whether it is actually literal. I think it's depicting the house that will eventually make up the FNAF 4 title screen's house. The porch matches this outcropping. The trees exist, but they're not the same trees. Why is that? Well, likely these trees exist here at Midnight Motorist for the same reason that identical trees exist on the borders of towns in Pokemon games. Tree tiles like this are how you create a boundary to block the player in to indicate a forest. These trees are here because we aren't supposed to walk anywhere else. There are trees on the FNAF 4 home screen. They're much more sparse than these, But it's very likely that these trees are here to represent those trees, and there's simply more of them to become a tree wall, something very common in video games. The lone house on the hill of the FNAF 4 screen seems much more sad than frightening. It's secluded on a hill rather than being in the woods. It could be cozy, or lonely, depending on perspective. But if it's unclear what tone the game is going for, I think the blood red tint and the monsters in the foreground tell us the answer. If you match up the maps we have of the area in Midnight Motorist and the map we have of the FNAF 4 gameplay house, you can actually see a pretty cool town layout. It's impossible to be that literal with what we have here because it's clearly not to scale, but I think this gives us a good depiction about what this town could look like. What was I saying? Right, interpretive primes us to have certain ideas based on the mood of the game. Symbolic, the other half of interpollistic, is less about the set dressing and more about the things literally being depicted and what they're supposed to mean in the story. The Fredbear plush's head being in the flower could be symbolic of a camera, or a speaker, or even the watchful gaze of William. There is something plush-like about this flower. If the plush is a camera, if the plush is a speaker, if the plush is William, if the plush is the ghost of Christmas present, then so is this flower. In many cases, these are basically the same thing, which is why I've combined them to the word interpollistic. The patch of dirt can be interpreted as a mound, and the mound can be interpreted as a grave, and the grave can be a symbol of William's failures or his hubris, which is why we're being shown this in the game. Scott Cawthon wants to show us William's hubris and failure, and so he made the dirt a different color. That is a valid reason to believe that this is a grave. However, I personally disagree. The thing is that while the plush's head in a flower is almost certainly symbolic, sometimes literal things are just literal. In my interpretation, this isn't symbolic. It's just telling us that the house on the hill is being built around the time that William lured one of the kids to Freddy's. It's telling us that this is 1985, and so we see the house on the hill being built in 1985. It's not deep symbolism. It's literal and it is functional. Whether something is symbolic or something is literal is always going to be in the eye of the beholder. We need to determine what the author meant when he said the flower is the plush's head versus what he meant when he said that there is a mound of dirt in the woods. The reason I fall into the camp that the patch or the mound are literal and functional rather than symbolic is because of the context that you find it within the game. This minigame that I've been calling Midnight Motorist isn't actually called Midnight Motorist. Midnight Motorist is an in-universe video game about dodging between cars. If you glitch out of Midnight Motorist, you access a game within a game. Within a game. This section of Midnight Motorist in the files is labeled Later That Night. The title of this section is interesting because it's also capable of being interpreted in different ways. Many people think that Later That Night is telling us that these events happen directly after the events of a previous minigame. In FNAF 6, you can also play a game called Security Puppet, in which we see William commit his first murder and speed off in a purple car. It's raining in that minigame, and so it makes sense that in Later That Night, we see the same purple car in the same rain, on the same night. This makes perfect sense, and I don't think it has any holes other than the notion that we're supposed to interpret this title at all. The name Later That Night is not present in the game, it's just what the files are labeled. This character that we call Couch Person is labeled as Person 2. Golden Freddy in FNAF 1 is labeled as Yellow Bear. The character we call Glitch Trap was labeled in the files as Glitch Trap, except Scott never wanted that to be his name. He has said that he wishes the character had been named Malhair. Glitch Trap was just used internally for file names while creating the game. His official name was supposed to be decided on and revealed later, but people dug through the files and so the name Glitch Trap stuck. Later That Night, while it could be interpreted as later the same night that Charlie died, can also be interpreted as later in the night from any of the lore-important nights in the Five Nights at Freddy's series. Or, in my opinion, it could mean nothing at all. It's a file name for the minigame that takes place after Midnight Motorist. Part 1 of the minigame is Midnight Motorist. Part 2 is Later That Night. It's after midnight, it's later. This is a note that Scott made for himself. This whole section comes later, after the night. We weren't supposed to see this. Scott probably knew that we would, or we could, but he's never before this point, and never after this point, hidden any lore information in the game files. If this was simply named Part 2, I don't think anyone would be trying to interpret what Part 2 means and what it has to do with the identity of Cheeto Man. But Later That Night, as a file name, seems kind of poetic. It seems like the title of a book, or it could be a card that appears on screen in a silent movie. Silent movies, especially those that depict dark and rainy nights and that still exist in the public conscious, are often horror movies like Frankenstein. The phrase Later That Night perfectly fits the aesthetic of the minigame, but that doesn't mean that it's supposed to be anything besides a technical phrase, besides the name of a file for Scott's benefit. Let's back up. Later That Night is the file name for something that follows a minigame called Midnight Motorist. Scott does not intend on us digging through the files of the game. Midnight Motorist is an optional minigame to purchase in the main game, although buying it is required for the Lorekeeper ending. In Midnight Motorist, you have to glitch through a wall to enter into Later That Night, and while playing Later That Night, you find this mound by going off-road in a way not explained anywhere. You do not need to see this mound to complete the Lorekeeper ending. The mound is a secret area, within a secret area, within an optional minigame that is only necessary for one of the completion endings. Unlike the Fredbear plush's head in a flower, which is mandatory to see during any playthrough of FNAF 4, this mound is as out of the way as it is possible to be. For that reason, I do not think it's supposed to be huge lore. These facts lead me to think that it's less likely that Scott wants us to interpret this symbolically, and more likely that it's supposed to be literal. I believe there's an inverse relationship between how clearly something is shown to us and how abstract it is. Something shoved right in our faces can be significantly more complicated with what it's supposed to represent. Something far away, difficult to see, that might not even be seen by everyone, is probably, on the contrary, significantly more literal. Imagine, in a dialogue-free interpretive ballet, a background character makes a small facial expression for a few seconds. Imagine if the creator of the ballet intended that facial expression to be interpreted a certain way to understand a key point in the overall story. That would be very bad writing. Likewise, it would be very odd for an audience member to see this facial expression and interpret that it was intended by the author to be the key detail that solves the entire story. On top of that, imagine if whatever this intended story is can only be solved by combining this face that was only displayed for a few seconds in the middle of the ballet with the real name of the actress portraying that dancer. Imagine if you were intended to look through the playbill, to look at the cast list, and to note the real name of that actress, and to combine that with the facial expression in the context it was made, in order to find what's actually going on in the ballet. Well, that would be absurd. And that's what Later That Night and the mound is. While this mystery that I laid out kinda sounds really cool, actually, not gonna lie, and is the kind of fourth wall breaking ARG mystery that Matt, Pat, and many other people would probably enjoy solving or making themselves, that doesn't mean that it's true. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you're a FNAF theorist, everything looks like deep lore. I think the Fredbear plush's head in the flower is meant to be interpreted by FNAF theorists, the way that the rats in the Nutcracker are intended to be symbolic. I think that the mound of dirt in the secret area of the optional minigame is not meant to be interpreted, the same way that the background dancer's facial expression is not meant to be interpreted, the same way that it's insane to expect someone to find the secret in the playbill. I don't think that we're intended to get anything from the name of this minigame in the files. That's my take on Midnight Motorist, and why I think it's significantly less difficult to understand than many people believe. If you listen to a lot of Midnight Motorist theories from people who believe that Cheeto Man is William Afton, you will very infrequently see them agree on what anything else in the story means. About when it takes place, about who the runaway is, about what Juniors is, about what the mound is. And even if people very strongly believe in their conclusion, most of them will agree that it's not satisfying, or that the puzzle itself that we're here to solve was written poorly. This is not true in the interpretation that Cheeto Man is not supposed to be William. In that interpretation, everything lines up perfectly. But of course, a story lining up perfectly and succinctly is not itself evidence to that conclusion being true. One of the issues in discussing Midnight Motorist is that FNAF 6 is not the only time that Midnight Motorist and Later That Night are mentioned across the series. There are arguably 4 times in which later that night is invoked. Twice in the FNAF movie, once in the Twisted Ones novel, and once in 5 Laps at Freddy's. In the FNAF movie, a guy wears a Midnight Motorist shirt. This is because Midnight Motorist is an in-universe game. That's probably it. Also in the movie, and in the Twisted Ones novel, we have a character who is at home. An animatronic goes to the house and kidnaps them and brings them to Freddy's. In the Twisted Ones, it's a twisted animatronic who captures Charlie within its stomach to go to Freddy's on William's orders. In the movie, it's Golden Freddy who goes to Abby's house, kills Aunt Jen, who is a woman sitting in the living room, while the protagonist is out of the house, and takes her to Freddy's because the animatronics want to be her friend. These 2 incidents, and Midnight Motorist, seem like parallels or remixes of each other. An animatronic goes to a kid's house, takes the kid to Freddy's. The problem is that in one instance it's by force, in another it's willingly, in one it's technically not their home, in the other one there is someone inside in the living room. One is on William's orders, one is on Golden Freddy's. There's very little in common besides the fact that an animatronic is abducting a child. So while an animatronic abducts a child in Midnight Motorist, I think that looking at the Twisted Ones or the movie to try to solve the issue of who is in the living room, what Junior's is, or what the mound is fruitless. And now to talk about the 4th and most recent depiction of Midnight Motorist. That would be in the demo for 5 Laps at Freddy's. 5 Laps at Freddy's is a spin-off kart racer not being developed by Scott Cawthon. The game is contentious because at the moment it's impossible to know if the developers had any input from Scott and how canon it's intended to be. There are 2 camps of thought here. There's the camp that it's canon and giving answers, and there's the camp that it's nonsense and just showing things that are recognizable to the community in a fun light. My opinion is the latter, but I don't think that the former is irrational. I think at the moment either conclusion is valid. What I do have a problem with is picking and choosing what from the game to take literally and what from the game to take interpollistically. If 5 Laps at Freddy's is believed to be 100% canon, if Scott's behind the game guiding it, confirming to us that the car is William's, that he's fleeing the site of Charlie's murder, that Junior's is a store or a bar, then you'd also have to agree that the mound, as it's depicted in 5 Laps at Freddy's, is the same as the mound as it's depicted in Midnight Motorist. The problem is, it's very clearly not. The mound that we see in 5 Laps at Freddy's is certainly not a grave. The mound is huge. Rock pile at a rock store huge. Construction site digging a hole huge. Bigger than a car huge. If 5 Laps at Freddy's is real, and we can use it as confirmation that Cheeto Man is William, that Junior's is a restaurant or a bar, and that this is what the mound is supposed to look like in a more realistic environment than an 8-bit minigame, then it is certainly not a grave. And if it's not a grave, what is it? I don't know, and no one else seems to know either. The responses I've seen from people are either to ignore it, or to claim that it is a grave, despite the fact that it is clearly not. There's only been 2 takes I've seen on 5 Laps at Freddy's. It's not canon and isn't overseen by Scott, and so it means nothing, or that it tells us the lore that we've been theorizing for years, and can be used as confirmation. If the second one is true, that means that no one, from Matt Pat to modern theorists, have been right about the mound, because no one has said that the mound is an enormous pile of dirt larger than a car. No one has brought up theories that don't include it being the sister location bunker, a grave, or Twisted Ones being buried under the dirt. I should say that no popular theories have put forth any other possibilities. A few minutes ago, I said I do not think it's supposed to be huge lore. And the problem with that is that it is physically huge. And if the rest of 5 Laps at Freddy's is confirming things about Midnight Motorist, why did this one detail change? Why is the mound bigger in FNAF than it is in FNAF? Were we on the wrong path all along, and what does it mean? This video is the second time I've unsolved Midnight Motorist. I'm pretty sure that FNAF is just wrong, but a lot of people seem to disagree. If you're one of those people, and you think Cheeto Man is William, that Midnight Motorist takes place after a crime was committed, that Junior's isn't a Freddy's location, etc., then what does this new context of the mound being significantly larger than a car mean? I'd love to hear new theories in the comments, or for people to make videos of their own. Or maybe, just maybe, I've convinced some people out there to take things more interpollistically than before, and to not see everything as a nail just because you're holding a hammer. Thank you for watching. Be sure to be nice to each other in the comments, consider supporting the creators you admire, never lose sight of the things that are important to you, and remember that Freddy's stands for friendly, respectful engagement, discussion, and discourse yields success.